and welcome to tonight's event to discuss the case for economic growth. My name is Oliver Hartwig and I'm the Executive Director of the New Zealand Initiative. It is great to see so many of you here. This must be the largest event we've held so far. Tonight's discussion is about our new publication on economic growth, authored by my colleagues Dr. Eric Crampton and Janisa Jerem. The book explains why we believe economic growth is good for us in many ways, and Eric will speak about it in a minute. After Eric has made his case for growth, we then want to explore what role economic growth should play in policy making. Is it the one defining goal of politics, or is it just one among many competing objectives? Or should we discard it as a goal altogether? We'll find out the answer to these questions from three up-and-coming MPs. We're grateful that they have taken their time out of their busy schedules to debate with us tonight, so welcome to our event. Let me introduce our political panel briefly. So, starting with Chris. Chris Bishop is a National List MP based in Lower Hutt who was first elected to Parliament in last year's election. If you are a regular at our events, you would also know that Chris is an award-winning debater who helped us adjudicate the initiative's next generation debates in the past. Tonight he's here not to adjudicate, but to debate, and we're glad to have you with us. Please welcome Chris Bishop. Chris is joined by Dr. David Clarke, who is the MP for Dunedin South and Labour's spokesperson for economic development. As David and I found out when we first met, he's one of the very few politicians in New Zealand with whom I could have a fluent conversation in German, because he lived in Germany twice. And if that's not enough to make David an unusual politician, he came to Parliament in 2011 having completed a circuitous route, having run a residential university college, worked as a Presbyterian minister, spent too long as a student, as he says himself, and done time as a Treasury analyst. Please welcome Dr. David Clarke. And last but not least, we have James Shaw with us tonight. James is a List MP for the Green Party and entered Parliament last year. He is a party's spokesperson for economic development, commerce, trade and investment, tourism, small business, sustainable business, SOEs, open government, and electoral reform. And because that's obviously not enough to keep James busy, who prior to politics worked as a consultant for PricewaterhouseCoopers and HSBC, he is also a candidate for the co-leadership of his party. So please welcome James Shaw.
Apart from longer life expectancy, better health, improved education, a cleaner environment, better opportunities for our children, and a happier country, what's economic growth really ever done for New Zealanders? You might be surprised to hear that economic growth fundamentally lies behind every one of those. The usual story is that there's trade-offs where, you can't get better environmental quality because we have the growth imperative, but in reality, economic growth is what lets us afford improvements to all of the kinds of things that we care about, all the things we find valuable. And that's one of the reasons that Janisa Jerem and I wrote this short report on economic growth. There's been growing complacence about economic growth in New Zealand around productivity growth and economic growth, and that if some policies come at the expense of growth, well, maybe we don't need to worry about it so much. What's half a percentage point in growth rates between friends, really? Really something to be worried about? Well, what's a percentage point of difference anyway? Think about going back to 1970. If real per capita GDP growth rates had been 1 percentage point higher in New Zealand over that period, we'd today have higher per capita GDP than Australia, and we'd be fourth in the OECD instead of below the median. A point can make a lot of difference when you take it over 45 years. And over that period, Australian economic growth only really outpaced New Zealand's by 1/3 of a point. But over 45 years, that matters. Or think about it another way. A 10% increase in real GDP per capita reduces the number of deaths in an earthquake by 5.3%, according to the best numbers I've found on it. As the global economy changes and the tyranny of economic distance seems to be worsening rather than improving, agglomeration matters, it's even more important that New Zealand stop its complacence about economic growth and productivity growth. Many of our policies around how we make housing needlessly expensive, and that especially hurts the poor. How we punish foreigners who want to bring their capital and their expertise here to invest and give jobs for people here. And how we manage to set environmental regimes around resource extraction that somehow manage to both stop development and provide worse environmental outcomes than alternatives. We need to stop doing that. We need to reevaluate those kinds of things with strong consideration of their effects on economic growth. Growth is good, and when we choose policies that come at a cost to growth, well, if we're going to do it, we should do it with our eyes wide open and in full recognition of the cost that's going to impose in the future. Thanks. I'll turn it over now to Chris.
If I only have about 10 minutes, so I want to, in this short speech, argue forcefully for you that economic growth is a good thing, has demonstrably made us better off and continues to do so. I want to deal with 3 specific objections that are commonly raised about economic growth, and then I want to talk specifically about New Zealand. So to start with the first proposition, which is that economic growth is good, and I hope this will be largely uncontested by my panellists today, because even the modern-day Green Party has come around to the view that economic growth is a good thing. Back in 1972, the Values Party, which is the precursor to the Green Party, of course, their manifesto talked earnestly about trying to achieve zero population growth so that we would have zero economic growth. And Rod Donald used to talk about negatively about the world's fixation with economic growth, and even as near ago as 2010, when Jeanette Fitzsimons retired from Parliament, she said we need to systematically examine the proposition that growth actually makes us better off. So I think James is made of sterner stuff than that, so I hope he doesn't agree with any of that, because I think even the Greens these days accept that growth is good. And the case for economic growth was put out in the New Zealand Initiative publication. I think it makes the case pretty well. Look, for me, the basic point is that economic growth gives us choices. So for thousands and probably millions of years, the lives of people in the world was nasty, brutish and short. The Industrial Revolution changed all that along with modern capitalism. Economic growth has made us wealthier and healthier. As we've got richer, child mortality has dropped and we're living longer, we can spend more on healthcare, we can invest more in education. The second objection is about the environment. Let's talk about that. And I made the point earlier that economic growth gives us choices. One of those choices is to care about the environment. The evidence shows that economic growth tends to improve environmental quality. Growth brings improvements in technology. Consumer demand grows for cleaner and greener products. The environmental records of the poorest nations in the world are generally shocking. And the reason for that is that they rightly, some would argue, prioritise economic development and the alleviation of poverty and hunger over the environment. And economists have even figured out a GDP per capita level where the trade-off starts to go the other way, where the environment starts to matter more, about $10,000 US per capita. People were generally astonished last year when China struck a historic deal with the United States to combat climate change, but it's utterly consistent with the model I've just laid out. And often the best way of dealing with environmental problems is through the market mechanism. New Zealand's been a world leader here, with fishing quotas, for example. Absent a system of enforceable property rights in fish, the tragedy of the commons would result, and our stocks would highly likely to be exhausted. So let me talk also about poverty and inequality, because this is the third objection commonly made to economic growth. The first point to make here is that global inequality between countries is declining. The inequality between countries is declining. That, of course, is a function of lifting billions of people out of poverty. The second point I would make is we have to be careful not to conflate the two, as people often do. They talk generically and generally about poverty and inequality. But the key point is poverty. Poverty is the most important thing to focus on. And as we've already heard from Eric, economic growth does lift people out of poverty. And Eric's given you the numbers, and so have I. And the third point is the point I've already made, is that growth gives us choices. The ability to lift the most vulnerable people out of poverty, to provide for them, the ability to have a highly redistributive justice welfare state. And as one commentator has noted in the past, you can't have social justice without economic growth. Economic growth gives us the ability to redistribute our resources to those who need it most, to the poor, to the sick, to the indigent, to those who can't care for themselves. But you've got to have a growing economy to do that in the first place. We have a highly redistributive justice welfare system in New Zealand, and that creates social justice. In conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, let me just say that I think we are on the cusp of something special as a country. We have tackled the global financial crisis. We are rebuilding Christchurch. We are starting to tackle the intractable social problems that have bedeviled New Zealand for far too long, like intergenerational welfare dependency and like housing affordability. And I believe that under our government and under John Key's leadership, we are set up for years of sustained economic growth. But we can't be complacent. We need sustained economic reform so that we grow at 3%, or better yet, 4% and 5%. And with that, that will create a better lives for all New Zealanders. Thank you.
As I said at the outset, I think we're going to agree on a great deal. Economic growth is the stuff of motherhood and apple pie. Points of debate, I think, will be more around the recipe for the pie, what flavour we're after, how to best cook the pie, how long the pie will last, and how best we divide it up to ensure future prosperity. Let me torture the metaphor just a little further. James, I think, will tell you that the pie won't cook if you don't look after the oven. And I have to say that I think Chris has already delivered a few political one-liners and some half-baked ideas. I am going to be very interested in the feedback afterwards and the conversations that follow. Labor, as you will know, is in a much advertised listening phase. The last two elections, we've said that we're willing to take some big policy calls to address what we regard as economic imbalances, and that, the pro-growth tax reform, R&D tax credits, and of course the capital gains tax, KiwiSaver extensions, monetary policy reform. And in Yes Minister terms, these are indeed kind of courageous policies that we took to the electorate, and they have been rewarded commensurately. If you accept economic growth is a good thing, and I think there is a burden of proof on those who don't, we will agree on much of what's required in a democracy to ensure it continues. We want enforceable property rights, strong rule of law, well-regulated markets. We might disagree on what that means, but we will want them. Demonstrable social mobility, a high-trust society, and a good education system for starters. And I want to use what remains of my 10 minutes, though, to introduce a couple of higher-level issues. The OECD suggested that if New Zealand had been a more equal society in recent decades, we would have had 15.5% more growth. I think that's a pretty stunning statistic. It warrants some good debate because that's what they think, and they are not lightweights, I think we'll agree. And the final point about why I think more equal societies grow the economy faster is that in a fair society, everyone's willing to put their shoulders to the wheel. And it's the point I alluded to earlier. Voluntary tax compliance is a good thing, but people will try and avoid paying their fair share if they think everyone else is. If they think some group has a special deal cut out, or they're not pulling their weight, or whatever, you have people who do not pull together to create a better society and a more productive society. People start to go to more selfish motives, and I don't think people are entirely selfish. That's my point of view. We'll debate how best to get there, and we already are, but I don't think that any of us will disagree that greater prosperity holds the potential for a better society. Thanks very much.
Can I just ask, so how many of you have read the report that we're discussing tonight yet? I recognise everyone's time poor here, so you may not have had a chance. Okay, great. Thank you. So for those of you that haven't, do have a read, although I recommend having some moisturiser to one side because it's pretty dry. I'm fascinated, actually, that anyone felt the need to defend the notion of economic growth because it is the dominant ideology of our times. And I recognise that the New Zealand Initiative is based in Wellington Central, where last year 30% did vote for the Green Party, so I can understand that you may feel under siege by the chattering classes, as you put it. But there's always Epsom. So first up, I'm going to say this out loud. I do not deny the material benefits that rising incomes have produced over the last few centuries. I am not opposed to growth in and of itself. As the report points out, as per capita incomes have increased, child mortality has declined, and life expectancy in countries like New Zealand has increased. We are healthier, richer, smarter, well, at least better educated than our forebears. The Greens talk about, or we are starting to talk about more about, something called the steady state economy, the idea, the notion that you can have an economy in which there is a steady state of material and energy throughput through the economy. And it's interesting to me that in the last couple of years, energy use has decoupled from economic growth. And last year, encouragingly, there seemed to be a small decoupling between carbon emissions, the growth in carbon emissions, and economic growth. These are good signs. This is good news. And that's globally, right? That's not just in any one country, that's globally. So it does seem that it may be possible to get to a situation where you can have economic growth and our running up or running past environmental, planetary limits isn't necessarily totally tied to that thing. So I'll just finish with a few other kind of fairly random thoughts. I was going to talk about pie, actually, but David has stolen most of that joke from me. I was going to say that, you know, National talks about wanting to grow the pie and Labour talks about wanting to divide the pie, and that the Greens have a tendency to say, well, the size of the pie is kind of limited by the size of the oven that you're cooking it in, and that while you're making pie, you should keep it clean, otherwise everyone will get food poisoning. But I'll finish with a couple of things. I haven't talked about, you know, alternative measures for GDP or anything like that, but there was a piece about happiness in the report, so I thought that I'd quote from one of my favourite economists, David Lee Roth, who said, "Money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you a nice big yacht to pull up alongside happiness." And what the report seems to hint at is another one. I can't remember who said this, I'm sorry, but it's kind of, you know, as I was kind of reading through it, that especially around the stuff around the environmental Kuznets curve, one of my favourite sayings, which is, if stupidity got us into this mess, well, why can't it get us out of it? Thanks.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. I'm sure you will all agree with me that we've just heard a fantastic, thought-provoking debate, and I would like to ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. Now, whether you agree with the publication or not, we think you should read it. And to make it more affordable and to increase the sales, we have reduced the price for tonight to just $10. The moisturizer is sold separately. If you would like to purchase a copy, please talk to one of our staff members. We've got copies over there. And if you enjoyed tonight's event, please sign up to our mailing list to receive invitations to future events, and of course to receive our weekly Insights newsletter. You can do this on our website, or you can just leave me your business card. And that's all for tonight. Once again, thank you all very much for attending, and I hope to see you at future events, and please join us for a drink now. Thank you.